By the mid-60s, the pop music industry was printing money, and this great success was generally limited to the East and West coasts of the United States. But by 1967, other bands started popping up to give bands like the Rascals, the Association, and the Byrds a run for their money. The Buckinghams were one of these bands. We're going to chart their course here on Pop Goes the 60s.
Hey baby, the plan I saw sure is metal. Glad that I'm a fella, and I know. Don't you care? Don't you care? Susan, looks like I'm losing. The truth and the sorry, one of you, joy will bring.
The entire tone of the 60s was set by the Beatles, and their influence created many a band. And in Chicago, there was a very vibrant club scene, and there were several radio stations ensuring that these bands would have a place to play and the records would get heard. And the foundation of the Buckinghams started in 1965, during this time, when members of the Centuries joined their local Chicago band, the Pulsations. Now, the Pulsations were made up of Carl Giammarese on guitar, Dennis Mikolas on organ, John Paulus on drums, Dennis Tufano and George LaGrosse singing, and Curtis Bachman on bass. In 1965, the Pulsations won a Battle of the Bands, which was on WGN-TV's all-time hits. And they performed live doing the Song of the Week, and this became a regular gig for them. And it wasn't long after they were signed to this that the producers of the show suggested that they change their name. And the suggestion was the Buckinghams. And I think the show's producers were trying to capitalize on the British invasion. But the Buckinghams liked it because it also referred to Buckingham Fountain, which is a famous tour attraction in Chicago's Grant Park. With some minor adjustments, the band became a five-piece, and these were the Buckinghams, featuring Carl Giammarese on guitar, Dennis Tufano guitar and lead vocals, Dennis Mikolas on keyboards, John Paulus on drums, and Nick Fortuna on bass. By late 1965, their popularity began to grow, and they had their own fan club, and they were playing on a lot of local television shows. Local promoter Carl Bonafetti was soon representing the band, and they were playing regularly at the Holiday Ballroom. And it was around this time that they cut their first single on the Ballroom's own Spectra Sound label.
If you wanted the star that shines so brightly to match the stardust in your eyes, beginner's love is sometimes the best. It might be a first, but it might be a last.
Sweets for My Sweet was a hit for the Searchers not that long before this, so them covering a British invasion style song further emphasized that they were actually British, and a lot of people would confuse them for being a British band. Now, Carl Bonafetti was kind of a local character in Chicago, and he also put together Chicago's first all-female rock band as a sister group to tour with the Buckinghams, called the Daughters of Eve. Bonafetti's connections got the band a record contract with Chicago's USA Records, and recording began at Chess Studios as the Buckinghams started experimenting with some different sounds. They typically played a lot of R&B. They were a pop-sounding band, but they did prefer R&B, and they were inspired by a local band called The Mob, who was another R&B band who had a horn section, and they're widely considered having started the Chicago horn sound in rock. USA Records began releasing a string of singles in 1966, seeing which one of these songs would hit. Now, they had recorded several songs, but they focused mostly on the rock and roll songs for the singles.
Well, if you leave me, I go crazy. Well, if you leave me, baby, oh, I go crazy. I call your name, you're not there. Was I to blame?
None of those songs charted on Billboard's Top 100, although one bubbled under and a few of them reached the very lower ends of the Cashbox chart. Now, Bonafetti knew of a songwriter in the group The Mob, Jim Holvey, and he was after him to write the band a hit. And they indeed recorded one of his songs. It was called Kind of a Drag, but USA Records really didn't hear a hit there. So it wasn't released until nearly the end of their contract as a last gasp single.
Kind of a drag when your baby don't love you.
Kind of a Drag broke in Chicago and soon spread out through the Midwest, and by the end of the year, 1966, it was all over the country. So they had basically a national hit, but they had no national management. They did not have a record contract, and they had no bass player as they had just fired Dennis Michaelis. Now he was replaced briefly by Larry Nestor, who gave way to Marty Greb at the end of 1966. The addition of Marty Greb strengthened the band considerably, and he could play guitar, keyboards, and saxophone. And he was also a songwriter. He was with the group The Exceptions, and he had played a little bit with Paul Butterfield and Mike Bloomfield, so he had a little bit of a pedigree. And he was, as a songwriter, he also inspired the other band members to write as well. By February of 1967, Kind of a Drag was #1 on Billboard, and they had knocked I'm a Believer by the Monkees off the top of the charts, and it sold over 1 million copies and was awarded a gold disc. Now, USA quickly assembled an album. They had all these tracks from these singles that didn't hit, and they assembled an album called Kind of a Drag. We mentioned earlier about the band being called the Buckinghams after Buckingham Fountain in Grant Park. Well, that's where this photo was taken. Even though it's very dark, I've never liked this photo because it's kind of fuzzy and you can't see the fountain really in the background much anyway, but that's where it was taken. When the Buckinghams recorded these single sides at USA, they were trying different styles. So they had some R&B songs, some rock and roll songs. That song, the first song you heard was a cover of the Hollies song, I've Been Wrong Before, and Don't Want to Cry was one of their more garagey type of songs with a really wild guitar solo.
Ever since I gave you my ring, girl, you just don't seem to get along. Love ain't enough to keep us together, babe.
So those last two songs were two more Jim Holvey songs. One was kind of a jangly folk rock song, and Love Ain't Enough was more of a moody rock ballad. Kind of a Drag got to number 109, so that's not bad. It shows you what a #1 song can do for an album. And USA Records, they were running out of songs to release. Even though the contract was over, they could still release music by the Buckinghams, and they released one other single to capitalize on the success of Kind of a Drag.
Well, Lordy, 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 Miss Lordy, well, you sure look good to me.
With a #1 song on their hands, the Buckinghams were hot property, and several record companies courted them. And it was around this time they met a guy named James Guercio. And he had been originally from Chicago, but he was in Los Angeles doing session work, playing bass with Chad and Jeremy, who he managed a bit. And he had played briefly with the Mothers of Invention. The band was impressed with Guercio's can-do attitude and his energy, and they quickly left Bonafetti and signed with Guercio. Now, Guercio wasted very little time getting them signed to a major record label, which was Columbia. Now, that wasn't too hard to do because they had a #1 song. So Guercio installed himself as producer, and he also had them signed to the William Morris Agency. Now, recognizing the band's unique sound, Guercio stuck with the brass rock approach. He didn't want to tinker too much with success. And Kind of a Drag was a hit, and Guercio had known Jim Holvey, the writer, so he went back to Holvey to see if he could provide yet another hit for the band.
If you don't love me, why don't you tell me?
Don't You Care was released about the same time as USA's 45, Lawdy Miss Clawdy, and Don't You Care easily outperformed it, reaching #6 on the Billboard chart. So by March and April of 1967, the band went to Hollywood to start to record more songs for their first Columbia album.
Darker skies and the fields we roamed in. Gone the sun, pitied be the blind boy who carries the hunter's stake, and woe unto together, you, but to remembering you.
Now here's their second album, Time and Charges, their first for Columbia. Now those four songs you just heard were all written by James Guercio. He contributed 6 songs to this album, so he clearly had the pop style down. And he also had a more topical song called Foreign Policy that included a snippet of a JFK speech.
And is not peace, in the last analysis, basically a matter of human rights?
Foreign Policy was rather progressive for the clean-cut Buckinghams, and Guercio even put together this discordant section with backwards horns and all these different sounds. And it may have been a slight overreach for the band, but it's one of the more interesting tracks on the album. Getting back to pop, the band's next single was somewhat of a surprise. It was Mercy, Mercy, Mercy that had been a hit for Cannonball Adderley a short 6 months prior. Now this was it's somewhat become a jazz standard, but at that time, when Adderley recorded it was an instrumental, and it had recently acquired a new set of lyrics, compliments of actress and lyricist Gail Fisher, who many of you might recognize from the TV show Mannix. Fisher, along with Vincent Levy, contributed lyrics to the popular instrumental. The Buckinghams version was a little bit more R&B than Adderley's, obviously, and they got their version, their arrangement from Larry Williams and Johnny Guitar Watson, who also had a minor hit with it in early 1967. Time and Charges did much better than the first album. It hit number 58 on the charts, and it's a clearly giant step. They found themselves, they found their sound, and put it all together in this album, and everything seemed to come together pretty well with this horn sound. And they had themselves 2 very big hits. Now, despite the hits, there was still a misconception that this band was British. For example, they appeared on the Smothers Brothers show, and the Smothers Brothers production team decked out the whole stage in Union Jacks. Now, by this time, we're in mid-1967, Summer of Love, and Guercio realized the band was on a roll, and he started to rehearse the band and started gathering songs for the third album. So he went back to Jim Holvey, the songwriter, for another song in the same kind of vein as Don't You Care, and came up with this one.
Hey baby, they're playing our song. Let's get back together, that's where we belong.
The band really liked doing Mercy, 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 which was a little more R&B, and that was more in tune with the beginnings of the band, really. They were a little more garagey and R&B. So when they did Hey Baby, they're playing our song, that song really established them as a light pop band. And it wasn't exactly the direction they wanted to go. Not long after that, they went back to Los Angeles to record another Jim Holvey song, Susan.
Susan, do you have to be confusing? I ask myself why.
What's interesting about the song Susan is that we are introduced to the girl that inspired the 4 hits written by Jim Holvey. Kind of a Drag, Don't You Care, Hey Baby, and Susan. According to Carl Giammarese, Susan was a Playboy bunny and Jim Holvey's girlfriend, and judging on some of these lyrics, she was, I guess, could be a bit of a challenge. So it's funny how these songs were not really right for Holvey's band, The Mob, which was a horn-based band, but seemed to fit the Buckinghams better. I should also mention that Holvey wrote 3 of these songs with writing partner Gary Beesbeer. Now, 1967 brought on a whole new style of production, and unfortunately for the Buckinghams, James Guercio began to run amok with some of his production techniques, and this is most evident on the song Susan. Now that freak out section, that was originally left empty that Guercio said he would fill. He's like, don't worry, I've got an idea for this. And when the band heard it, they did not like it. They just found it gratuitous. And I don't think it fits the song at all. And many radio DJs just edited that out. And the song ended up getting to number 11 and number 7 in Cashbox. The next album, Portraits, was released December 27th, 1967, and this had the hits Hey Baby and Susan, and the band took a more creative approach on this album. Gone were the Guercio compositions, those were replaced by band compositions, in addition to the 2 Holvey-Beesbeer songs. Led by Marty Greb, the Portraits album uses a heavier guitar sound and a more psychedelic approach to the melody and the arrangements.
is trying to twist my mind. Is full of jealousy. You'll have to wait and see. The truth and the sign.
The overall sound of Portraits kept with the horn sound, but it's not as much in the forefront as the past two albums. And sometimes it gets in the way. It's a little more of Guercio's over-the-top production. So that was the third time Guercio used a similar freak-out production in one of his songs. They all sound similar, and none of them add to the song. They only detract from it. Aside from that, his production is actually very good. Very good balance of the strings, harmonies. So without those little psychedelic embellishments, this is a really finely produced album.
You're rising from your sleep, and have you noticed you're alive? I don't seem to find much space in here. I thought I'd fit in any place in here. The sun is shining inside. I've got this feeling of pride. The girls I've met are the best.
Now, Portraits charted at a relatively disappointing number 53, and it was a couple positions better than the prior album, but with two big hits, those hits didn't seem to push it any further on the charts. And I think part of that had to do with their image. And this was the time when things started to get into the heavier rock trend, and they just didn't fit that. And you can even see by the uniforms on the album cover, this was becoming a bit of a passé look. Other bands that utilized this didn't keep it for very long, including Paul Revere and the Raiders, Gary Puckett and the Union Gap, the New Colony Six, and even Buffalo Springfield. During the course of 1967, the band had over 300 appearances live and on TV, and they were named by Billboard magazine as the most listened to band in America, and their sales were second only to the Monkees in the United States. Despite this success, James Guercio was canned as their manager/producer, and part of this reason had to do with some of the production I talked about earlier, but it had more to do with money. And the way that the publishing was set up with this band was that all the publishing went through James Guercio's publishing company. That made Guercio a rich man. He took most of the publishing, and the band got relatively nothing. Now, the band confronted him about this, and Guercio agreed to change this and share more evenly, but then he reneged on that. So he found himself fired. This was not the only time this would happen to Guercio. The same thing happened to him with another very big band he would manage in the 70s, and that is Chicago. We are now in the first half of 1968, and the band has been touring on the Portraits album and doing a lot of appearances on television. And they were given a new producer, Jimmy Wisner, to work on this album. And they started working on this one in the summer of 1968, called it In One Ear and Gone Tomorrow. With the success of 1967, the band was very confident going into recording this fourth album. And this was led by Marty Greb, who did the lion's share of the songwriting, though everybody contributed. And these songs were a little more introspective, but it didn't lose the Buckinghams sound. Now, the first song that led off the album is the mildly psychedelic Song of the Breeze.
It's a sound you can hear if you try. It's the song of the breeze. I think I know I love her. I think I love her. What will you say today?
Now, these songs are a little more in line with the progressive rock songs of the day, but the band stuck to what they did best, which was pop ballads.
I hear the music coming out of your radio. Are you there with another boy instead of me? Here I am back in love again, and I'm happy that it's not pretend. At last I found a girl to give.
Back in Love Again was the single that preceded the album, And it sounds like it was written by the writing team of Holvey and Biesbeer, but it was written by Marty Greb. Unfortunately, it didn't have the success of the former team, and this song only got to number 57.
I see a girl that looks at me, and I look back. Please don't try to call, don't even try to say goodbye. Your sympathy's no good, 'cause it just makes me cry.
That last up-tempo song was another Greb original that was a leftover from some of Guercio's production from the prior sessions, and it was considered to be released as a single, but never was. Now, In One Ear and Gone Tomorrow only reached number 161, so the band must have been disappointed. And this album does pale in comparison to the prior two albums, each of whom had two big hits on them. So they didn't have the hits on this one to carry them through. And Wisner's production does the band justice, but it just wasn't a hit. Now, despite not having any hits on the album, another reason for not doing as well is the changing rock trends in music. But also there was a marijuana bust. The band was busted for pot, and this was in Iowa. And what was bad is that, most bands, the cool bands, it wouldn't have affected them too much. But in this case, the Buckinghams were more of a clean-cut band, and the college bookings and some of the TV appearances started to dry up because of the bust. And after this, there was a Buckinghams Day in Chicago that had to be canceled. Now, their next single was done in true Buckingham form. It's called Where Do You Come From?
Where did you come from? If you're real, I can't believe my eyes.
Unfortunately, this song only bubbled under at number 117, and it was used in the film The Guru, which came out in early 1969. Now, The Guru, not a very big hit movie. It's about a guy who goes to India to learn how to play sitar. Sound familiar? Yeah, sounds like George Harrison, doesn't it? And it starred Michael York and Rita Tushingham.
It's a beautiful day.
Now, those last two singles barely charted, and right around this time, the Buckinghams released a greatest hits. Now, this is an excellent compilation. This got to number 73, so that's not too bad, but it's I think it's a low chart position for a greatest hits album, but it just shows you that they still had a pretty good following, and it's too bad a couple of those later singles didn't get put on here.
I got a feeling that we're heading for bad times. I got a feeling that there's something on your mind.
Now, these later singles all were pretty solid songs done in the Buckingham tradition, and there were enough tracks to put together another full album, but nothing else came out.
You taught me better than I've ever learned in school. I know that I can find somewhere inside. Time has brought us together. This we feel with our hearts. Oh, the change has come. I just don't know how to say goodbye. I just don't know how to say goodbye.
Like many 60s bands, the Buckinghams couldn't make that transition to the Woodstock rock era. And many of the bands like the Beach Boys, Buckinghams, or the Association, bands that were trying to do this, they were really playing to an older crowd. And the younger crowd on the AM dial who was listening to Sugar Sugar really wasn't interesting. So they kind of fell in between those two. Sometimes it's called too hip for the square, too square for the hip. So unfortunately, they fell into that category, and they saw the writing on the wall, and they split up in 1970. Now, this was my first album that I bought by the Buckinghams. I bought this new in the mid-'80s. I'm not sure if it's in print anymore, but it was in print a very long time. And it was replaced by this compilation, Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. This came out in 1991. So this is basically their singles, and it includes a few of the later singles that were not an album and one unreleased song. Some very good liner notes here. That's on Columbia. And there are two other discs I got here. This is the second and third album, Time and Charges plus Portraits, and In One Ear, Gone Tomorrow. This one has all those later single bonus tracks, and these are both by Sunday. So these are also very good if you're looking to get these on CD. There was another compilation called The Complete Hit Singles, which is similar to this Columbia release right here. It's also very good. It concentrates just on the singles. And that is a brief history of the Buckinghams. I hope you enjoyed that. This was one of my more requested bands to do, and I find that the requests are all over the map, but I do like, this is one band I've listened to a lot over the years, and that 60s pop, this just takes me back to being a kid, and it's just some very nice music. And some of the deep cuts on some of these albums are a little bit more progressive, and you might be surprised at the quality of some of them. So the Buckinghams really don't get the credit they deserve for some of those album tracks that are actually quite good, and many of them are self-written. So I thank you for watching. Make sure to check out my merch at popgoes60s.com. Feel free to check out my Patreon subscription as well if you want to contribute in a bigger way. And we'll see you next time here on Pop Goes the 60s.